I will take the name Mexican enemies have given me. The whites will learn it. And you...
For decades, Jay Silverheels was the face of Tonto, the loyal, fearless companion to the Lone Ranger. Millions of fans cheered every time he appeared on screen, seeing only the heroic sidekick, the man who brought dignity and strength to a role that could have been mere stereotype. But behind the mask of Hollywood fame lay a life far more complex, far more challenging, and far darker than most ever imagined. Born Harold J. Smith in 1912 on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, Silverheels grew up navigating a world that never seemed to welcome him. As a Mohawk, he faced prejudice and discrimination at every turn. The acting industry was no exception. Hollywood offered him fame, yes, but only if he fit into the narrow and often demeaning image of what an Indian should look like. Silverheels was determined to defy those limitations. He trained as an athlete, played lacrosse professionally, and fought in boxing rings, building strength and confidence that would carry him into acting. Yet even as he achieved success on screen, he battled a Hollywood system that refused to see him as a full human being. Rather, he was the Indian or the sidekick, often typecast and underpaid. Off camera, Jay's life was far from easy. The pressures of fame, the isolation from family and community, and the struggle to claim his identity in a world that constantly tried to define him created a tension few could understand. Even as he became a symbol of heroism for a generation of viewers, the man behind Tonto wrestled with personal tragedies, broken relationships, and the fight to maintain his dignity. Now, decades after his rise to stardom, the truth about Jay Silverheels is finally coming to light. It's a story not just of fame and Hollywood glitz, but of resilience, injustice, and the hidden battles faced by a man who became larger than life. While constantly trying to survive in a world determined, Jay Silverheels wasn't born a star. He was born Harold J. Smith in 1912 on the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, the son of a Mohawk family rooted in tradition, resilience, and pride. Life on the reserve was far from easy. Poverty, limited opportunities, and systemic discrimination were constants. But young Harold learned early the values that would carry him through life: hard work, determination, and the importance of community. From an early age, Silverheels excelled physically. He became a skilled lacrosse player, a sport revered in Native communities, where agility, strategy, and strength were celebrated. His athletic prowess didn't stop there. He also trained as a boxer, earning the nickname the Mohawk Hawk for his ferocity in the ring. Sports offered him more than trophies or fame. They gave him confidence in a world that often treated him as invisible. But even as he excelled, Harold knew that life beyond the reserve would demand more than talent. Opportunities for indigenous people were severely limited, and Hollywood was even worse. When he moved toward acting in the 1930s, he quickly discovered that the film industry was willing to hire him, but only if he fit a very narrow mold. Studios didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a caricature of the Indian, a sidekick, an extra, someone whose presence could fill a stereotype but not tell a story. Determined to succeed, Silverheels reinvented himself. He adopted the stage name Jay Silverheels, a nod to his athletic grace and his desire to create a persona that Hollywood would remember. He trained relentlessly in acting, voice work, and stagecraft, using his charisma and natural presence to break into films that few indigenous actors could access. Still, it was a constant struggle. The roles offered were often demeaning, the pay was minimal, and the recognition was fleeting. He wasn't allowed to be the hero, only the helper, the silent partner, the one who would fade behind the white protagonist. Yet Silverheels refused to be invisible. Every performance, every stunt, every line delivered with authenticity was a quiet act of rebellion. He brought dignity to roles that could easily have been offensive, subtly challenging Hollywood's limited view of Native peoples. Even when playing a character like Tonto, a sidekick by design, he infused depth, intelligence, and humanity, qualities that audiences often took for granted. but which inspired countless indigenous viewers who saw themselves reflected on screen for the first time. Off-camera, life remained complicated. Jay faced prejudice, financial struggles, and the loneliness of being one of the few Native actors in a predominantly white industry. Relationships were strained and opportunities were scarce outside the limited roles Hollywood offered. Yet he persevered, driven by a mixture of pride, ambition, and a desire to leave a legacy beyond the stereotypes. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Silverheels had begun appearing in more substantial roles, earning a reputation as a reliable, talented actor who could handle stunts, emotional scenes, and complex choreography. But it wasn't until 1949, when he was cast as Tonto in The Lone Ranger, that he truly became a household name. Tonto would change everything, for better and worse. On one hand, it brought fame, financial stability, and a platform to subtly challenge Hollywood's portrayal of Native peoples. On the other, it tied him to a single character, one that often overshadowed his personal achievements, his talent, and the struggles he had endured to get there. Even so, Jay Silverheels never lost sight of where he came from. The lessons of the Six Nations Reserve, resilience, pride, and honor were always with him, quietly shaping the man who would soon become immortalized on television, to see him only as a character. When The Lone Ranger first premiered in 1949, television was still finding its footing. Audiences were hungry for heroes, men who embodied justice, courage, and honor. The show delivered exactly that, but it was Tonto, played by Jay Silverheels, who quietly captured hearts in ways no one expected. With his calm voice, unwavering loyalty, and quiet strength, Silverheels turned what could have been a background role into something iconic. Yet, behind that iconic image was a man constantly at war with the industry that made him famous. Silverheels had accepted the role of Tonto, knowing full well the risks. He understood that playing a Native character written by non-Native writers would come with cultural inaccuracies and stereotypes. But he also knew that refusing the role might mean the end of his career, and the loss of an opportunity to give at least some dignity to Native representation on screen. So he took it upon himself to reshape Tonto's image from within. He changed his dialogue, softened broken English into something more deliberate and wise, and refused to portray Tonto as a fool. His quiet intelligence became the heart of the show. Tonto knew things the Lone Ranger didn't, Silverheels once said with a wry smile. He just didn't need to say them out loud. However, the fame that came with the Lone Ranger was double-edged. For millions of viewers, Tonto became the defining image of Native Americans. Children dressed as him for Halloween. Fans mailed letters by the hundreds. But while audiences adored him, Hollywood continued to see Silverheels as one thing and one thing only: the Indian sidekick. Roles outside that mold were non-existent. Despite his rising popularity, Jay was paid far less than his co-star, Clayton Moore, who played the Lone Ranger. Moore's name appeared above the title, his likeness on every poster. Silverheels, meanwhile, often wasn't even invited to promotional events. He endured the humiliation silently with grace, but it weighed on him deeply. Off-set, he found himself confronting racism from fans and colleagues alike. Reporters would ask him patronizing questions about his tribe, often treating him more like a novelty than a respected actor. Producers dismissed his ideas for improving Native representation. Even his attempts to correct historical inaccuracies were brushed aside. Hollywood wanted Tonto, not Jay Silverheels, the intelligent, outspoken Mohawk man behind the character. But Silverheels never stopped pushing for respect. Between filming, he gave talks to schools and Native organizations, encouraging indigenous youth to be proud of who they were. He reminded them that though Tonto was fictional, dignity was real, and something no one could take from them. Privately, though, Jay's success brought new struggles. The long hours, constant typecasting, and emotional strain began to take their toll. He turned to alcohol during some of the hardest periods, a coping mechanism shared by many who faced deep-seated prejudice in Hollywood. Friends described him as both fiercely proud and quietly tormented, a man who wanted to break free from the very role that had defined him. Still, Jay Silverheels never let bitterness consume him. When The Lone Ranger ended in 1957, he continued acting, taking guest roles in films and television. Though the parts were often small, he approached each with professionalism and humility. Yet the shadow of Tonto followed him everywhere, in interviews, on the street, and even in later years when new generations rediscovered the show. In time, Silverheels began to embrace the character in his own way. He realized that Tonto, for all his limitations, had become a symbol of loyalty, wisdom, and honor, values that aligned with Jay's own heritage. Instead of rejecting the role, he reclaimed it, using his fame to draw attention to the lack of opportunities for Native actors. By the 1960s, Jay had begun mentoring young Indigenous performers, helping them navigate an industry that had given him both success and sorrow. "If I can open one door," he said in an interview, "then all the fighting was worth it." But the fight was far from over, beneath the calm exterior and public respect. For a man as intelligent and ambitious as Jay, that reality was suffocating. He wanted to act, truly act, to show the world that he could play any part, not just the one that Hollywood decided belonged to him. But those opportunities never came. Behind closed doors, casting directors would praise his work as Tonto, then admit there just weren't any roles for Indians right now. It was a rejection wrapped in politeness, the kind that cut the deepest. The emotional toll was immense. Jay had fought hard to bring respect to his characters, but he began to realize that respect wasn't enough if it didn't lead to equality. "Tonto made me famous," he once said quietly, "but he also made me invisible." Still, Jay Silverheels was not the kind of man to surrender to bitterness. Instead, he turned his frustration into action. In the mid-1960s, he co-founded the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles, a pioneering effort to train and support Native performers seeking fair representation in film and television. Funded mostly out of his own pocket, the workshop became a haven for Indigenous actors who wanted to tell their own stories and be seen as more than stereotypes. It was one of the first organizations of its kind, decades ahead of its time. Jay taught acting techniques, coached younger performers, and helped them understand the business side of Hollywood. To them, he wasn't just Tonto, he was a mentor, a fighter, and a living example of perseverance. "He taught us to walk tall," one student later recalled. He said, "Don't ever let anyone tell you what you can't be." Yet even as he worked tirelessly for others, Jay's personal struggles continued. Years of constant rejection, financial instability, and the emotional weight of his career began to show. He suffered health problems later in life, strokes and complications that limited his speech and movement. Friends said that the once energetic actor grew quieter, more reflective. He rarely complained, but those close to him sensed the pain behind his stoic demeanor. Still, there were moments of light. In 1979, Jay Silverheels became the first Native American actor to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a long overdue acknowledgement of his contributions to entertainment and representation. When the day came, friends and fans gathered to celebrate, and for a brief moment, Hollywood seemed to recognize what he had accomplished. Standing beside that star, his face weathered by years of hard work, Jay smiled humbly and said, "It's been a long trail, but even that moment carried bittersweet weight. Many felt it was far too late, an honor that should have come when he was at his peak, not after decades of being overlooked." Jay himself understood this. He accepted the recognition not as a personal victory, but as a symbol of progress for all Indigenous artists who would come after him. By the early 1980s, Jay's health had declined significantly. He spent much of his time at home with his family, reminiscing about the old days on set and the people he had met along the way. Despite his physical struggles, his spirit remained unbroken. He never lost his humor, one friend said. He'd still joke about Tonto saving the lone. "Ranger, one more time." Jay Silverheels passed away in 1980, at the age of 67. His death marked the end of an era, the loss of a man who had carried both the pride and the pain of his people into mainstream America. But his story didn't end there. In the years that followed, a new generation of Native actors, from Graham Greene to Wes Studi, would rise, each of them acknowledging Jay as the man who first opened the door. His courage, his patience, and his quiet defiance became part of Hollywood's history, even if the industry had been slow to appreciate it. Jay Silverheels may have played Tonto, but his true legacy was far greater. He wasn't just a sidekick on television. He was a trailblazer who turned a stereotype into a symbol of strength, and in doing so, paved the way for every indigenous performer who came after him. When Jay Silverheels passed away in 1980, it marked not just the end of a man's life, but the closing of a painful, transformative chapter in Hollywood history. His death was quietly reported, a few lines in newspapers, brief mentions on television. But among Native communities, artists, and those who had worked beside him, the loss was deeply felt. Jay had not only played a beloved character, he had carried a burden that few could ever understand, the weight of representation in an industry that had rarely been kind to his people. In the decades since his passing, the true depth of Silverheels' legacy has begun to emerge. For years, Tonto was remembered as a pop culture figure, the silent companion who always stood by the Lone Ranger. But as time passed and the lens of history sharpened, people began to look beyond the character and see the man, a Mohawk actor who refused to let Hollywood define him, who brought humanity and respect to a role that easily could have been a caricature. Jay Silverheels' courage lay not in grand speeches or dramatic protests, but in the quiet dignity with which he approached every challenge. At a time when Native actors were often forced into humiliating portrayals, he insisted on performing with pride. He transformed Tonto from a stereotype into a figure of strength, wisdom, and moral clarity, and a character that, in many ways, was truer to the spirit of Native resilience than the writers ever intended. His advocacy work, too, left a lasting mark. The Indian Actors Workshop, which he co-founded, laid the foundation for generations of Native performers who would later break through Hollywood's barriers. Today, Native-led films and television shows, from Smoke Signals to Reservation Dogs, owe a quiet debt to Jay Silverheels, the man who first fought for their right to exist on screen with authenticity. In many ways, his life mirrored the struggles of the characters he portrayed. Brave, loyal, but constantly fighting to be seen as more than a sidekick. He never achieved the stardom or wealth his co-stars enjoyed, yet his moral legacy outshines them all. For Jay, success was never about fame. It was about dignity. "If I can be remembered," he once said, "let it be for the way I carried myself." In the years after his death, recognition finally came. His name began appearing in books and documentaries about the evolution of Native representation in Hollywood. Film historians began to acknowledge that Silverheels was more than just an actor. He was a pioneer who helped reshape how indigenous people were seen, both on screen and in society. His influence extended beyond entertainment. For many indigenous viewers growing up in the 1950s and 60s, Tonto was the first Native hero they had ever seen on television. While the role was imperfect, Jay's portrayal gave them someone to root for, someone who was brave, loyal, and strong. Decades later, many Native elders still speak of watching him with pride, recognizing that beneath the Hollywood gloss was a man who carried their stories, their struggles, and their spirit. Today, Jay Silverheels' star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame stands as a quiet monument to that legacy. Thousands pass by it daily, unaware of the hardships behind that name, the discrimination, the isolation, and the determination it took for a Mohawk man to etch himself into the heart of an industry that tried to keep him invisible. Yet for those who know his story, that star represents more than celebrity. It stands for persistence, representation, and the unyielding belief that dignity can shine even in the darkest corners of history. In recent years, actors and activists have called for greater acknowledgement of Silverheels' contributions. Documentaries and tributes have reframed his story, not as that of a sidekick, but as that of a trailblazer, the man who carried the first torch for Native representation in Hollywood. And though he's long gone, his spirit endures in every indigenous actor who stands tall, speaks boldly, and demands to be seen for who they truly are. Jay Silverheels once said, "The real fight isn't on the screen, it's in being seen for who you are." That simple truth became his life's message. He played Tonto? Yes. But he lived as something far greater, a symbol of quiet resistance, cultural pride, and enduring strength. And now, at long last, the truth of Jay Silverheels has come to light. Not the sidekick, not the stereotype, but the man who taught Hollywood and the world what it means to stand proud in the face of silence.